Okay, on Tuesday, we were just kind of giving a little intro into the course, like the ethos it is for people that it's in any caregiving field, particularly nursing, for the most of you that are in this. And also the moral agency, right? That's really this idea that you have to foresee obstacles to good care for the patient and try to overcome those. So that last little quick scenario I gave you about the elderly person who would be agitated if his wife wasn't in the room with him, you know, your moral agency for that individual would be to foresee there's going to be an obstacle to this person's good care. You know, so I need to, you know, intervene now so that that doesn't get interrupted. So that's the idea. Now, today, I did ask you, do not judge this course by today and next Tuesday, right? Because this is a little bit of logic that gets, it's an introduction to this course, which is your ethical component, right? So it's not just strictly nursing ethics. There's basic ethics that we'll be talking about before we start applying the principles. And how do you want to say, I realize like some of it is new to you. I mean, there's only one, I think, that had any logic background, so some of this might be almost like a foreign language to that degree. So remember, on your midterms and your finals, the questions at the top of like the prompts, that's what I'm after. You're not going to be able to, I'm not going to ask you to break all this stuff down in some sort of multiple response or such on your midterm and your final. You know, so the fact that you know what an argument is, the fact that you know the basic structure of a syllogism, you know, and the difference between validity and soundness, you know, that's really what I'm after here. But I don't just want to say what that is and leave it at that, because that's just information, right? In education, we like to take information and have it turn into knowledge, which is judgments, and then hopefully even understand it, which is a penetration of the knowledge. So what I'm giving you today, especially the second slide, typically I try to keep things on one slide, and we'll see how it goes. The second slide, you might be looking at it going, what the heck is this? And I'm just trying to explain how arguments work and such. I cannot believe that some of this would not be beneficial to you. But I also know that, you know, logic is its own beast, and it's not everybody's thing, okay, that type of, you know, unfortunately, because if we had more people that were backed in this, I think we'd have a little easier, you know, discussions. We'll leave it at that for now. All right. Now, the reality is that the reason why we even bother studying logic is because either you are going to think about thinking or you're not going to think about thinking. So remember how I said to some degree people, maybe not articulate it such, but they think in the back of their heads that there is some default, you know, ethic. And well, here's what I would do. You know, and they just kind of do it on a case by case. Well, it's that way with thinking too. Sometimes you wonder, like, how did you arrive at that? You know, did you just, are you going along with the flow? Is that something from an experience you had? Did you reason it out? If you did reason it out, did you reason it out well? That type of thing. So, you know, philosophy and logic are not the same, right? If philosophy, in the most general sense, the study of wisdom, right, the love of wisdom and the study of that, you know, logic is the tool. It's how you use to make rational judgments and such. As a matter of fact, let's just go right to that. So when we talk about what logic is, it's a study of judging and reasoning in order to arrive at a truth, okay? So it's this idea that I'm going to make judgments and I'm going to use reason, and my goal is to arrive at a truth. It's not just to win an argument. As a matter of fact, has anybody ever heard the term sophistry or sophist? Back in ancient Greek, they were like the hired arguers, okay? Socrates reamed them out. In other words, they were the people that would teach you how to win an argument. And sometimes you even see books out that today, like How Never to Lose an Argument. Throw that away. We're not out to win arguments. We're out to get the truth. And we want to make sure that our reasoning is sound. So that's kind of what we're going after today. Anyway, the problem is that too often, when I say the level of outrage, you know, determines the veracity of the argument, don't oftentimes in culture, the people who shout the loudest just kind of like, whatever. I mean, it's not even that we just go along with them because we don't want to deal with it, although that might be true sometimes. We, in the back of our minds, think they're very sincere. You know, and they're coming across, when somebody comes across very sincere, we tend to equate that with, validity and truth. And that's not true. It could be true, but it's not necessarily true. So we have to try to find a way to have an argument that doesn't, fall into that particular outrage. So, anybody here that either, has children or nieces and, nephews or, as a parent, I would love to have thought that me and my wife have the bulk of influence on our children, but most sociological studies say that's not how it works. Peers have a huge influence on young people, as does genetics. So it's kind of funny, like my wife goes into psychology, and one of my daughters goes into psychology, the other one goes into a similar care field, nursing, right? And here I'm in, philosophy with at least one degree in theology, and then I have a daughter who was my little twin since she was this big, goes and gets a dual bachelor's in philosophy and theology. You wonder how that stuff works out, right? And it's funny because I used to tease her, even when she was in 9th grade, she'd want to spend Fridays, can you imagine this, sitting down and talking philosophy and such with me. So we'd go over this kind of stuff. And when she was taking logic at the undergraduate level, I told her, I said, certain things are going to happen. I said, you're going to find yourself a it's going to be hard for you to watch the news. Because you know how, no matter what your field is, you pick apart like the popular shows of something. Like for instance, if the people that I know that have degrees in history don't watch the History Channel, which is ironic. It's not like they don't think some of it's right, they just think it's not quite right, okay? Now, we can't know everything about everything. And I know when they touch into my field and I'm watching the History Channel, I'm thinking, that's not even close. I mean, it sounds good as it rolls off, so then I reason from that, well, if they're not right on the things that I do know, chances are they may not be too right on the things that you don't know, that type of thing. Okay, so if a person really gets good at understanding, logic and argumentation, you're watching, these talking heads in the news, and all you're doing is fallacy, fallacy. And you're not only that, you name it, right? So, as my wife would, gladly point out, it doesn't make you a nice person to be around because you're picking everything apart. You don't even mean to be. So if you get really good at something like this, it doesn't make you better than anybody. And it absolutely doesn't make you smarter than somebody. But it does make you understand things a little clearer. And not only that, you're going to be able to explain exactly why something's wrong. So if you've heard things before said and it doesn't sound right, I'm not saying with 2 days of this you'll be able to, but who knows, right? You'll actually be able to say it. That's not right, okay? So there's a certain, what I would call I don't know what you want to say. There's something good about that, all right? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit. So I'll call that like a sense of armor, right? It almost shields you from falling into fallacious thinking, which will be on Tuesday. Tuesday we'll talk about a few fallacies and such, and how you look that out. This is an old term, so I don't know that anybody would have heard this, but did you ever hear of wearing your tag on the outside? I wouldn't think you would hear of it because today people buy shirts with everything on the outside. So back in the day, the shirts that have the little alligators on, I don't know what brand that is. I totally forget. Okay.
Lacoste?
What is it?
Lacoste?
It could be. It doesn't sound right, but it could be. I really don't know. Okay.
Lacoste.
But there was a day when those things first came out that other people were mimicking them. So how did you know if you had the genuine one? Well, guys in high school that had money would wear the shirt inside out. And then you could see the tag. So you knew if the tag actually came from that or not. Well, today, nobody cares about that. Forget about the fact that the tag was today. I mean, and I'm not here to poke fun at anybody, so don't think I'm like, making fun. But we actually wear shirts with the advertising on it. Think about it. Somebody will wear a shirt that says Old Navy. They have convinced you to buy a shirt to advertise for them. Could you imagine that? And you're doing it for free. Now, okay, it's a cool shirt, you really like it. But have you seen anybody walking around campus with a shirt that says Sears? Walmart? I mean, why? I mean, because it's not popular. So, we've gotten to the point where, we'll gladly, promote this for you. And even if it's a really nice shirt, I get that, right? And things that maybe, like, I see Converse are coming back, is that true? Okay, so when I was young, you know, there was an Army-Navy store, and the kids that grew up in my poor neighborhood, you went and there was a shopping cart outside of the Army-Navy with these red shoes, white shoes, and black shoes. They were Converse. They were $5. If you wore those, you were the poor kid. What happened now? Those little canvas shoes are probably popular. Somebody has convinced us that these things are good. We've been played with. That's all this is. You know? So all of a sudden, because a particular basketball player, and I'm just making this up, wears a sneaker, all of a sudden everybody wants to wear that sneaker. Now, you know down deep that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? But once you learn logic, you can actually say that's the improper conversion of any proposition. Not that it's going to convince anybody, but that's what that is. Just because that person wears a sneaker doesn't mean that's going to transfer to you, right? So there's a certain amount of shielding that this does. It almost makes you, if you're really clever with this, it makes you impervious. I mean, advertising still is necessary, because if I want to know where's a good place to eat, by all means, you know, let's give it a try. You know, but I'm not probably going to be fooled for something, or if I am, I'll ferret it out. And we certainly can't know everything. I mean, there's no way. I mean, you know, the idea, like I had this one philosophy professor up at Hudson University, a student had asked her some question about philosophy, and she couldn't answer it. And the student was a little indignant. Well, how can you have a PhD in something and not be able to answer it in philosophy? And her answer was perfect. You know, having a PhD in something doesn't mean I know everything in that discipline. It simply means I know enough in that discipline to have a PhD, right? So because we can't know everything about all things, what logic does also is it kind of gives us an idea where we can at least sense something's not right in the argument. I don't need to have all the facts. Something's not right in your argument, all right? That type of thing. So I think that's the good part to it, right? So you recognize and you identify, and this is just really a reiteration, you're recognizing and you're identifying these things that are kind of going wrong. And I don't know, I can only speak for myself. It made me, you know, the cynic. You know, now I think there's an ulterior motive in everything. And my wife, literally, I would get up in the morning and I would turn on 2 different cable TV. I don't watch the news. I get a Reuters feed or something. But I would turn on 2 different cable shows and then start pointing stuff out just for fun. My wife said, "Will you knock it off?" That type of thing. You know, it's getting annoying. I'm like, I know, but it's fun to do, right? So it's that. So there's a sense to that, you know. So this is applicable. It doesn't matter what you go into, and to be honest, it doesn't matter what field you go into. There's no way that, in this sense, philosophy could not help. There's just no way. All right. Now, there's good parts. When I say offensive, I'm talking about the positive stuff, right? It at the very least helps you be more articulate, which can never hurt, all right? And we'll look at that real quick today, like what some of that means. But the better that somebody can understand what exactly you're after or you want to do, it's got to be a plus, all right? And the last part isn't too much different. When I really... It's funny, the one logic book that my daughter used of mine, when she returned it to me, there was a note on the inside that says, "Excuse me for all the stains that are from my tears," you know. She found it very difficult, although she did well in it. But what I had told her throughout this was, don't try to win the argument, try to get to the truth. And if somebody corrects you, shake their hand and thank them, because they've given you a little bit of education. And it's not bad to not know something. It's really only bad not to know something twice. So if somebody can improve what you said, then all for it. So I would always tell her that you need to be a very good listener. In other words, you know, we often will only listen to the extent that the other person stops talking, so that we can say what we want to say. In other words, they've already started talking and we're ready to rebut it. We're ready. But how are we going to rebut? We haven't yet heard what they wanted to say. So the goal, I told them, is listen, actually let them build their argument, and then see if it's valid, see if it's sound, and if it's not, then go after the one thing that would correct it or refute it. I said it narrows down your argument, so it's listening to what a person is saying, and then obviously, you know, working from that. So there's advantages, and again, think of this as a tool. That's probably the best way for us to at least consider it here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look through what they're called 3 acts of the minds, right? Terms, propositions, and then syllogism, which is the argument itself. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the terms, or what a term is. Okay. So there's probably a lot of different, ways we can describe this. But if you've ever had confusing language, or if you're not quite sure what somebody meant, it's because there was some issue with the term. A term is not the same as a word, right? Because a term could be a group of words. It doesn't have to just be a single word. But if we were to use, say, a vague term like tall, like if somebody said, hey, my son goes to Villanova and he's in nursing, do you have him in your class? What's he look like? Well, he's tall. I don't know what that means, And let's forget about Villanova. If somebody said, my son, he's tall, he's 3.5 feet, but he's only 5 years old. You have no idea. So what we try to do in our conversation, and let's just say right off the front that nobody walks around like a robot, right? Like that guy from Big Bang Theory. I mean, nobody likes that person where you're constantly, laying everything out. And again, my family hears it all the time, and so they'll play back to me if I don't give something that's quite exact. You always say words matter, words matter. Well, they do, because you really have to narrow down. If you're going to try to understand what somebody is saying, and perhaps even respond back to them, you better know exactly what we're talking about before you move on, right? So rather than saying somebody's tall, it's probably better to say, well, he's like about 5'10", or something like that. It doesn't matter if you even consider that tall. It's like, at least now we know, right? So there's all kinds of issues about whether or not something, same thing. It's like if you're giving directions to somebody, well, it's that building over there with the windows all on the one side. Excuse me, which, like all of them, or the guy with the hat. So all these things wind up being just issues between exactness and vague, all right? Now, let me ask you this. What do you think, what's healthy? Just give me some examples. What's healthy?
Fruits.
What is it?
Fruits.
Fruit's healthy? Okay. What else is healthy?
Exercise.
Exercise is healthy. What else is healthy?
Sleep.
Sleep is healthy. Can people and pets be healthy? Can they all be healthy in the same way? I mean, if somebody might say tofu's healthy. If it's unhealthy, then we go, oh no, let's do something to the tofu, right? We're using this term in different ways. In other words, fruits and sleep and tofu or whatever, those are things that might contribute to health. They're not healthy in themselves. A person who is, maybe had a cold and they got over it and now they've recovered their health, they are healthy. So, we have to watch how we're using these terms. Now, that's always obvious when you talk about something, like this and lay it out. But the reality is that it's not always really certain what a person is trying to say. So we have to do our best to use one exact language and then make sure that what we're talking about is unambiguous. So again, because otherwise, if you've ever, I know you've caught yourself talking to somebody and it gets passionate, right, because they're trying to use their level of outrage for the veracity of their argument, and you need to wait for them to stop talking so you can simply say, that's not what I meant. You ever have that? Okay. Well, the better that you can do, making sure that you're speaking exact and unambiguous, the less chance of that. And if they go off the rail, you can simply say, that is not what I said. In fact, I was very careful in the terms that I used. But, again, terms have, different, they even change in themselves. So like when I do philosophy courses and we get into social justice and we do immigration, and they start talking about immigration numbers between, George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump, I tell them, I said, you better figure out what that term means, because it has changed meanings over the course of those 3 terms, and it doesn't mean the same thing. So if a person's talking about why did, why were there so many more unquote illegal immigrants during the Barack Obama is because of the way that the person was determined to be an immigrant, right? The definition changed. And has anybody ever wondered what a definition of a definition is? Ever wondered about that? There's at least, 5 or 6 different definitions of a definition. Like if I held up a pen, right, I could talk about the definition of a pen by its material. Well, it's a plastic, instrument, it has a spring and such. I could talk about it perhaps by who we call it the efficient cause, who made it. Well, a pen is an instrument that's made by the big company. That would be one way to talk about it. I could say by its, let's say, its formal cause. I could talk about how it's put together. I could just say it's a writing instrument. Or I can use some like genus. It's a writing instrument that uses ink. I'm doing something specific. So there's all kinds of ways. So using definitions also gets to be very, critical in our discussions. Now, we know what that is? Okay. Not everybody would, right? You notice I'm trying to avoid even saying it, because I know I could say it, but I know if I try to say it now, I'm going to scoop it up. A sphygmomanometer. Does that sound right? Okay. So that's a very clear term. Okay? I mean, if you use that term, it's very clear. But the reality is that clarity only resides in the listener. Now, that's not that obscure of a term, so maybe, many people would know it. But that's not probably a term you would use when you're in a room, right, to the patient, obviously. As a matter of fact, it'd probably be perfectly fine just to say, I'm going into the blood pressure thingamajiggy, because all you're trying to do is communicate exactly what you're doing. So, even like in ceramics, right, or anybody who's like blast furnaces, I could use a phrase or a term, the stoichiometric. It's a very clear term, but it's only clear if you know it. So that's another issue that we have to have. Anytime we're trying to use these terms, we have to make sure they're exact, they're unambiguous, and that it's clear. And the clarity you're going to have to read off of the individual. I don't care what field you go into, that's going to help you. Because as you're starting to communicate with somebody and you start to see the puzzled look on their face, you know where to stop. What is it that you don't understand? Well, I don't know what that is. So you have to find a different way to explain it, that type of thing. All right? So this is what they would call the first act of the mind. And it's a simple apprehension of terms. So this is Aristotle, right? And Aristotle says the minute that we try to, work towards reason and judgment, the very first act is we're going to have an apprehension of the terms. And there's a whole boatload of things, characteristics that we can talk about. These 3 are perfectly fine. I'm just after you to get some sort of impression on this. That's really all I wanted from it. Now, the second act of the mind, we're going to be talking about propositions, right? Now, we don't talk in logical form. We just talk in normal English, thank goodness, right? But because we talk in normal English, we don't always quite know exactly what somebody said. So if you ever had an issue of trying to understand what a quiz question said, it's probably because you weren't very good at putting it back into logical form. And just because a person talks in normal tones doesn't mean that they're communicating what they want to say properly either. So this isn't, nobody's that computerized in their mind, at least nobody I know, that can take every single thing somebody says and put it back into logical form. But we almost do this intuitively because we're trying to figure out what a person is saying, right? So if somebody says, to be a nurse is to be compassionate, we'd have to say, well, what do we do with this? First of all, we're going to talk about the parts of it, okay? If I had to put that into logical form, I would say all those who are nurses are those who are compassionate. Now, it doesn't say all, but it's implying that, isn't it? So I have to, in my mind, think, because again, if we're going to start looking at arguments and what refutes a particular argument, or what the problem with an argument is, sometimes that's it alone, that a person used all or none instead of some. And they weren't quite careful with that, right? So we would say all those who are nurses, and there's different ways to say it, are those who are compassionate. All right, so, I'm a big Led Zeppelin fan, by Stairway to Heaven, all that glitters is not gold. to put all that glitters is not gold into logical form would be some things that glitter are gold. It's an easier way to understand it, isn't it? Because, you know, sometimes people will say, well, all that glitters is not, okay, all, because all makes you think it's everything, but it's not, because it's saying all that glitters is not gold. So it's just the way that the whole thing is phrased. So when you're able to put something into logical form, you can honestly say, I know exactly what this person has said. It may not be what they meant, that's a different issue, but I know exactly what they said. Now, the parts of these things. The first thing, there's 4 parts. The first is a quantifier. Now, in syllogistic logic, which is all we're doing here, this is not, you know, mathematical logic. It could be all, it could be none, or it could be some. Those are really your choices, all right? All, some, or none. That which is a nurse is what we call the subject. And that's a term, okay? That's the term. The R is the copula. Now, a copula can be are or is, if it's affirming something, or it could be is not or are not, if it's denying something, all right? And a copula is just what the word sounds like. It's only really supposed to connect. What we'll see here is the predicate with the actual subject. So, when you hear people say things like, that's predicated of something, they're saying it, that is coming from that. So when somebody says, all those who are nurses are those who are compassionate, those who are compassionate is predicated of the subject. And here's a little thing, like even in English. There's a lot of like so-called rules in English, but not rules in English. Like, have you ever heard, like, don't end in a preposition? It's not true. I mean, it's not even a rule. You won't even find it in any grammar rule book. It's a carryover from Latin. And you'll also hear sometimes people say, like, you can say, I am well. Don't say I am good. That's not true either, right? Because you say I am, the am is a copulative verb that really, the good goes back to the I. So it's proper linguistically to say I am good. What you wouldn't say is I play soccer good. There you have to flip it around because now it's an adverb, right? That type of thing. So it's the same language, all I'm trying to make from that. So we have a quantifier, a subject, a copula, and the predicate. And that puts us into a proposition. This is the second act of the mind. So what we're going to do now is look at a few things, hopefully, that might help clear it up. All right. So if somebody just says, I think people only become nurses for the money. All right. Okay. Now, nursing's not a half-bad paying profession, but it's not one that's going to make you rich. All right. And it's got enough demands. If a person only wanted to make money, there's probably other ways to do it, right? If somebody were to say that, what do you think? Are they talking about all, some, or none? What do you think? All, some, or none? I think people only become nurses for the money. All. Yeah, they're talking about all. Okay? So if we had to put this into some sort of logical form, and again, there could be variations on this, but we'd probably say all people who become nurses, there are people who desire money. Now, we're not arguing about whether or not it's true or false. We're not even concerned about that at this point. Okay? Now, I would guess, does that kind of make sense? All I'm trying to do is I took what they said and I tried to put it into the propositional form. So we have a quantifier, a subject, copula, and a predicate, right? If I were to respond back to somebody like that, right? Because I don't think that I would want to just simply to say that's, it's okay to say, well, no, that's wrong. But I'd say, no, most nurses want to help others. I think that's a good statement, right? Now, when I said, no, most nurses want to help others, am I referring to all, none, or some? Some. See, it kind of throws you off because you see the no. But see, in normal language, and again, this is just me saying it, I'm throwing my conclusion out there at the beginning. Like, no, that's my conclusion. And now I'm going to tell you why, And the way I would put it in the logical form is I'm going to say, look, some people become nurses are people who want to help others. Now, that's enough to refute the argument. You don't really need to do anything else. Because that person backed themselves. If they were to start up and say, some people only want to become nurses for the money, you might have to say, yeah, you can have an argument over how many some, it's still, that would be an odd statement to make, I think. But you would probably say, well, I would agree, but I can't imagine that that's really high up there for most people, maybe a couple. But if somebody were to try to say that, they just go into that for the money. You'd say, well, look, some people who do that are for the money. And if your statement is true, it refutes their argument. All right? But we're not there yet. We're going to do this. We're going to put this in argument form in a second. So this is the second act of the mind. And the second act of the mind is a judgment. Propositions, and this is what you need to know, propositions can only be true and false. That's it. Arguments, as we will see on the next slide, are never true and false. That's not what they are. They're valid or invalid, sound or unsound. Statements are true and false. So terms, for the sake of this particular course, are only going to be, vague or exact, ambiguous or unambiguous, clear or unclear, but propositions can only be true or false. So what we'll do when we get into arguments with people is we're going to try to figure out maybe their argument form is good. Because if you've ever listened to something and you're not quite sure, that sounds right, but it doesn't sound right, you're probably getting to the point where it's a valid argument, but there's something wrong there, that kind of thing. And it's probably because one of the propositions are not true. Or then we would say it's not a sound argument, that type of thing, right? We'll look at that. Do you have any questions on this? Again, you don't have to ferret all this out. The questions on the prompts is what I'm after.
So, I know you talked about the judgment. You also said like an argument. So argument can't be.
Well, we're going to do that on the next slide. So don't worry about that yet. But this would be like the second. So and you could think about this almost systematically. We're looking at terms, we're using the right terms, and then we're putting something into a proposition. Because remember, what we're trying to do with using logic as a tool is we're trying the systematic study of judging and reasoning in order to arrive at a truth. So we want to get to a truth in the end, and the way that we will do that. Now, it's entirely likely that you people will be writing some paper, especially if you go into nursing, you'll be writing something, in your professional career and otherwise too. Well, it's very important to have the argument right there, because once you put it into paper and you get the thing peer-reviewed published, if something isn't right there, it'll get chopped up. And somebody will immediately point out your argument's not even sound. The unfortunate part of this is that, we don't walk around as little logicians. So if you try to explain to somebody why their argument is wrong, they're probably not going to understand it. And that's okay to a certain degree. Because we're going to see is that, this is one way that we arrive at rational truth. But we don't do everything in our lives as a rational truth. I married up. What I did to get my wife today would literally be called stalking. If I were to try to reason with her through syllogistic arguments, the woman would not have bought it, right? So I would not have went and said, here are my good reasons why I think that we should date. Or, I know they don't call it anymore, now it's called a thing, right? So, no, it's cool. My kids would be really embarrassed right now. So this is important for us to work through arguments and such, but we also realize that it has its limitations. Most of the things that are very important in our lives, beauty and truth and goodness and justice and liberty and equality, those aren't things we arrive at through syllogistic arguments. And that doesn't mean that the terms don't have to be good and the way that we present the arguments don't have to be good. We just have to know that, there's other ways to arrive at knowledge, but nonetheless. Okay. Any other questions on that? Let's see what time it is. Where does this go to?
2:15.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, I know the popular connotation for an argument is probably more what we'll call here quarreling. Why are you two arguing? Okay. Arguing is good. Arguing is what we should be doing. Arguing is what we wish we can get, people within our government to do. Sit down and have a good argument rather than quarreling. But unfortunately, you know the system. They have to appeal to certain people, and most of it becomes emotive. And, you know, you think about it, and I'm not trying to get political here, but we talk about, I hear on the news about Russian influence. They're putting these ads out there that are swaying people, and we need to stop it. Why can't we stop people from paying attention to ads that make no sense? I mean, you know, it's like we're worrying about the wrong end. Who are these people out there that is reading something from a website that has, you know, 500 words in it and think that this is true? And, you know, so you wonder, there was a time, you know, when this was taught in grammar school. And there's still some private schools that started teaching this in 3rd grade. You might say, well, can you learn it 3rd grade? Well, you can start learning some of the basics. I taught high school for a while. I tried to teach logic in, you know, to seniors, and it was difficult, right? And it's not a mandatory thing. So now we're actually getting through the undergraduate careers with never really touching this, unless you're an actual philosophy major, and then you'll take it. Otherwise, you can get through. And that doesn't mean that you're not a reasonable thinker, you know, but it does mean that you didn't quite get systematic tools to work through stuff. So we're after arguments. That's the good thing. Again, we want to think about thinking. And we're going to say that that is the definition for an argument, and I think it's in the paperwork that you had. So if we can get 2 or more premises, right, and the premises are a proposition. If we have 2 more propositions and that leads to some sort of conclusion, and that conclusion is where the truth is. Now, there's so much more we can talk about. Obviously, this is a course. But the reality is nobody talks in 3-part syllogisms. We usually talk in 2 parts. We usually just, you know, imply one of them, and I'll explain that as we go. So, you know, when we're hearing, we always have to kind of hear, and sometimes it's more than 3 parts. You know, sometimes you can map out somebody's argument, and it might fill a page before you kind of figure out what they're trying to go with this. That's the definition of an argument. We're the 3rd act of the mind. This is called discursive reasoning, all right? So, true or false, as far as propositions, the 2nd act of the mind, the terms, you know, exact, ambiguous, and such, and so forth. 3rd act of the mind, discursive reasoning, and we're going to be only here talking about validity or invalidity, and soundness or unsoundness. And that's going to be a little odd for you, because you can have a sound argument, you can have a valid argument that's unsound. In other words, there's something, it's the form's right. You know, somebody could say, and I'm making this up, you know, all frogs are, everything that's green is a frog, that's green, therefore it's a frog. It's a valid argument, but of course that's not true, you know. But it's the way that I said it. I said it in a way, so that's the difference. So it's funny because you can have a conversation and tell somebody, okay, your argument's valid, but you're wrong on this point. And because you're wrong on that point, your conclusion is wrong. And reasoning in this way that we're trying to build the argument is always trying to come to a conclusion that's true. That's what we're after. We're after a true conclusion. You can come to a true conclusion with an invalid argument, which sometimes people are, you know, can be right in spite of themselves, which then you should not be a jerk and explain all that, but help them fix it. It's like, look, you're right, but don't argue it because of that, because that doesn't make any sense. And if you say that outside of this room, people are going to like think there's something wrong. So, you know, say it this way, that type of thing. Okay. All right. So this was from the last page, so it's nothing new. We're going to say, I think people only become nurses for the money, and then I tried to put it in a logical form saying, well, all people who become nurses are those people who desire money. Now, here's how we're going to do this. And I don't want you to get overly confused because I'm not going to ask you to work all this out. Again, I don't want to just give you the bottom line information. I'd like you to have some knowledge and understanding behind it. If we had to work this out into an argument, it's going to have a major premise, a minor premise, and then the conclusion. So we probably would say all that which is a sole motivation, our career, you know, is that which only has a desire for money. We almost have to make the assumption that somebody's saying people do stuff for the money, all right? The minor premise, all people that become nurses, they're doing it for the sole motivation, all right? So you could see when the standard, I think people only become nurses for the money, this is going to be in the conclusion. We're trying to figure out how did they get there, right? Because if you really, and again, this is just systematic, and we're just doing this as an example, but if you were trying to like rebut somebody's research or something, you're going to have to try to figure out what reasoning did they use to get there. Now, they should spell it out for you, but if they don't, you're going to have to do it anyway. And in politics, they'll never spell it out. You've got to try to figure out how did they get to that. And then you're going to have to try to figure out how does this work. Okay, so the conclusion, therefore, all people become nurses are those who only has a desire for money. Sometimes the wording's awkward, the wording in a logical form. So let me explain to you how this works. And you're not going to have to do this back to me, so that if it sounds complex to you, I don't want you to worry about it too much. All right. The subject in the conclusion is going to be the subject in your minor premise. All right? That's how that would work. And we can come back, we'll come back to this. The predicate in the conclusion is going to be the predicate in the major premise. So what you do is you pull something from each of these premises, and then you make a conclusion. That's how you build an argument. You're starting out by, I have this premise, and then I have this premise. I mean, I don't care what you want to do. If you want to say, you know, wow, this type of spaghetti is the best spaghetti, you're going to have to work that out into some sort of argument. So and what we're not talking about here is the arrangement of this. There's form and mood, all kinds of stuff. And when I learned this, I could not have learned it in a more difficult way. And I told the professor that. The guy literally taught how the medieval monks would do this. And they would use, like, it looked like Latin, but it wasn't Latin, where all the letters meant something, and you had to line them all up. I said, if somebody sat down and said, what is the most complex way to learn something simple, that would be it. And the professor said, yeah, I agree, but it was brutal, you know, it was brutal. So what happens then is that one thing that doesn't get into the conclusion, that's known as the middle term, okay? So that middle term is important because if that's not the same, then people are kind of arguing two different things. In other words, there has to be something in both of their premises that is the same. Or what are we really comparing? So, not that you need to know this, but this is what's known as an A proposition. This is all S is P, all right? All S is P, therefore all S is P. And that's known as the bullet. You can't get any clearer in argumentation than that. There's all kinds of different arguments. Sometimes you can say some are not, none are, none, that type of thing. But the A proposition. So when I said that when you said to somebody, if you wear these sneakers, therefore, you know, you'll have whatever, okay, you wear that cologne, then you'll smell like J-Lo, all right? So you're saying all the people who do this are those. And you're building the argument. But what happens is, if you reverse those, you can't always say that all the people who wear that smell like, you know, J-Lo, and then J-Lo, you know, because she wears it smells like this. You can't just switch the two things around. It's called a conversion. So it's improper. So when somebody tries to make a claim through advertising, and advertising is where we find most of this comes. It's amazing how we've been played with advertising. You guys want something? This is interesting. Did anybody ever make instant cake batter? Instant cake mix. Anybody do instant cake mix? What do you have to add to an instant cake mix? What do you have to add?
Milk, eggs.
Milk, egg, or water, right? So let's just say water and egg. Now, did you ever wonder why do you have to have an egg? They can make it. Why can't they just malt? They could put it in there like a powder. I mean, you know, the industries don't do that. I mean, when the big industries, they don't like figure out to put eggs in. Do you know how that came about? You know, like everybody's in study, what do they call them? Focus groups. You guys know what focus groups are, right? Where they try to figure out, like, you know, who's going to like this product. Now, you're going to laugh at this, especially, you know, the women. But back in the 1920s and 30s, when Betty Crocker was trying to come up with an instant cake batter, they made one, all you had was water. But the women didn't like it. Because, I'm sorry, I know you're gonna laugh. This is dating. They didn't like it because they didn't feel like they were doing enough for their husbands. So what they did was they kept playing with it. What will it take till they feel they've contributed? And the focus groups came back saying as long as they could put an egg in, that made them feel like they contributed and they got over whatever little guilt problems they had. To this day, there's an egg in it for that reason. That's the truth. Isn't that something?
Wait, so there's no reason to...
No, they could make a powdered egg. I mean, then they could put it in. There's nobody's going to. Now, I'm sure that's not the reason today. Today, it would probably, they won't do it because it's been branded for so long, right? That type of thing. But that's advertising. So what happens with advertising is they try to find out, like, I want to sell this to you. What's the obstacle? Once they, through focus groups, determine the obstacle, now they're going to figure out how to remove the obstacle. Once they remove the obstacle, bye, bye, bye. I mean, that's what happens. Same thing with, like, if you follow the history of smoking, cigarettes, it was a male thing. It just wasn't something women did in the 1920s. They couldn't get women to do it. Why do they want to sell to women? Double the market, right? So what they did was they hired actresses. This is really off the cuff, but it's interesting stuff. They hired actresses to walk in parades with cigarettes, but they didn't call them cigarettes, they called them victory sticks. And then, before you know it, the highfalutin, women started smoking and made it respectable, and then the lower class women who thought, this is how I can look like the higher class women, and before you know it, smoking. What's the obstacle? How do I remove it, right? So what does logic do? Logic kind of makes you immune to that sound, so, I know you just did, right? So, in other words, you still need advertising because we want to know where to go get something to eat, but you're less likely going to be bought into something, right? That's my spiel for that. Okay. So anyway, let's say this though. That's a valid argument, but it's unsound, right? Because we didn't agree with that. We did not agree that people become nurses only because they desire money. But the way that it's laid out, because the subject in the conclusion is the subject in the minor premise, the predicate in the conclusion is the predicate in the major premise, and it's got a middle term. There's other things I'm not telling you, but you don't need to know about whether or not something has been distributed or non-distributed, but that's a valid argument. So you couldn't say that their form of the argument is wrong, but we still don't agree with it. But we don't agree with it because there's something that's not true, okay? There's something that's not true, and what we're saying, at the very least, is that all people that become nurses are doing so for sole motivation. It's unlikely. Maybe both of them are untrue, but we know that's at least not true. So therefore, it's not sound. So you could tell somebody, well, your argument's valid, but your conclusion's wrong because it's based on an unsound premise. You start off with a bad premise, you're going to wind up with a bad premise. There's no other way to do it, all right? Does that kind of make sense? And again, I don't expect you to give me all this back. It's good that you know this, right?
So what would make about an argument invalid? So
Okay.
that's the conclusion.
You would have to, in other words, we'd have to, at least in this particular case, we'd have to switch it up. Like, for instance, if this were the, if that was the middle term, and I flip these things, like I flip this middle term over here, and then this, I wound up having a subject from the major premise and a subject from the minor premise both wind up down here, the form would be wrong, all right? So that alone would make it an invalid argument. Or if I didn't have a middle term, if I didn't have something in there, I could probably give you examples. I hate to do it off the cuff, because when I do it off the cuff, I say it and I'm listening to something like, oh no, and then I get myself confused. But nonetheless, what I want you to know is there's a distinction between validity and soundness, okay? That type of thing. Now we're going to look at an argument, our rebuttal, if you want to call it that, where we said no, most nurses want to help others, okay? And we said the logical form of that would be some people who become nurses are people who want to help others. Okay, now this would be a way that I can really demonstrate how you can make this unvalid. Because if I had some, and then all, you can't do that. I can't talk about some people and then some people and then and then conclude all people. You know, I've already thrown it out, okay? But here I would say, I'm going to get out of the way for you. Okay, so some of that which is a motivation for a career is that which desire to help others. I think we'd all agree, okay? Some part of why you want to go into a caregiving field is because you want to help others. Some people want to become nurses. That's their motivation. Why not, right? Seems pretty reasonable. Therefore, some people will become nurses or those who desire to help others. So what we've done is we've taken, just like we said, we took the subject from the conclusion as the subject in the minor premise. We're fine there, okay? We took the predicate in the conclusion is the predicate in the major premise. We're fine there. And we also have a middle term. And even though I'm not talking about it, it's distributed at least once. So that which is a motivation and that which is a motivation. So we then, as long as this is valid, and as long as we've concluded that both our minor and major premises are true, we're good. I mean, there's really nothing here to go. So we have, at this point, we have a valid and a sound argument. Now, here's the beauty of argumentation. If you agree with a major premise, if you're talking to somebody and you give them a major, forget about the major and minor, you give them a premise and another premise, and they agree with both your premises, and logically and validly then it forms a conclusion, and they say, well, I don't agree with the conclusion. You don't get that choice. You don't. At that point, that's the only conclusion you could draw. It doesn't matter what you think. I mean, so at this point, we don't care about, well, that goes against how I believe. I'm sorry, you know. Well, still, that doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't matter if it doesn't make any sense to you. You have to accept the conclusion, all right? So if we were to work this out then, all we would say then, just to clear it up, is that our conclusion refutes their conclusion. And there's not much else you can say about it. And, you know, again, I'm trying to make the point, you know, nobody goes through life like this. But if you're really trying to determine something, whatever it is that you might be working on, you're going to be working this out in your head. And if something doesn't sound right, you're going to have to start determining, well, is it in good form? Is the logical form good? If the logical form good and it's still not something that you agree with, is one of the premises wrong? And if you find out both of the premises are wrong and the form's good, you better start changing your mind because you're wrong. And there's no other way to put it, you know? Now, obviously arguments are more complex typically than this. But nonetheless, this is how things should be resolved. If we're going to say, you know, that our goal is to arrive through reason and judgments at a true, you know, conclusion, this is how we do it, all right? So let me just double check to make sure what I was asking of you guys. Okay, we talked about the relation between ethics and philosophy, right? And there was positive, negative aspects. We did that. I talked about the attributes of a term and a proposition. So if I were to ask you on a midterm or such, you would have to come up with an example. And I don't want you to use an example of tall, you know, or sphygmometer. Come up with something else. You know, if you say, well, if there I ask you, you know, give me some sort of issue with ambiguity in a term. And let's not use love either, because that's the basic one, right? I mean, you can, you know, I love, my wife's called the cheesecake, and I love her, and I love my children, and I love God, but I can't love them all in the same way, right? So that becomes an ambiguous term. So it's difficult for us to say. And we're going to see on Tuesday how the terms, when they get put into slogans, themselves become fallacies. Because slogans get accepted as arguments. And unfortunately, you know, most people, and presidential slogans are, you know, the worst of them, right? I mean, they're meant to rally the troops, but we don't really know what they mean, and we don't know who disagrees with them, you know, because we're not quite sure what they said, that type of thing. So nonetheless, let's see, the last thing here was, you get a simple syllogistic argument. It's enough for you to be able to clarify that, you know, two premises lead to a conclusion, and if the premises are both true, you have to accept the conclusion. You should be able to articulate back to me that if there's something wrong with the logical form, then it's not valid. But if it is valid and there's something wrong with one of the premises, then it's not sound. And if it is, you know, if there's nothing wrong with the premises, their truth or the judgments, and the logic's good, then it's valid and sound, and boom, there you go. Whether you, somebody's, you know, you don't have to have somebody submit, you've won the argument at that point. There's nowhere else to go, okay? Did that at least make it sound a little simpler, hopefully, than you might have thought?
Does one false premise automatically make it an invalid argument?
No, it would make it an unsound argument, okay? It would make it an unsound argument.
So that would be, so simply, it's, if you have two true premises, it's going to be sound. If you don't have a true premise, it's unsound.
Yes.
Otherwise, in conclusion-wise, if you have have a conclusion that you would agree with and sound premises, it's going to be valid.
Absolutely. And, you know, if there's any exceptions, don't worry about that, because we're keeping this simple. Now, the reason why this is so important in normal conversation is because you might be talking to somebody, you might actually agree with what they just concluded. But you're like, that doesn't make any sense what you just said. Yeah, but it was true. Okay, the proposition was true in arguments. When you hear people talk colloquially, like, you know, look, my argument's true. No, an argument can't be true or false. Only a proposition can be true and false because they're statements. An argument can only be valid or invalid, or sound and unsound. That's it, okay? So, but you might actually think like, look, I agree with your conclusion, because what happens then is if their conclusion was good, but one of the premises was bad, they might assume you agree with the premise. No, I don't. You know, and I really don't want to bring in a lot of examples because it's not, this is not a logic course. It's just that, you know, Dr. Koch, who just walked out of here, you know, we're trying to keep this consistent, and he starts out with logic. The one thing I'm doing a little different is we're going to talk about personhood a little bit more, at least I think. I haven't sat through one of his courses, I'm not entirely sure. But nonetheless, so then on Tuesday, what we'll do is we'll talk more about volitionist, like fallacies. Like what are some of the things that when you hear that it's not right for other reasons, okay? Anything else? Is that bad? Yeah, it was that bad. Okay. Have a good weekend.